Good evening. Good evening. If you can find a seat, we'll get started. My name is Jim Stockard, and I'm the curator of the Loeb Fellowship at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and I'm particularly delighted to welcome all of you here this evening on behalf of the GSD and of our dean, Mohsen Mostafavi. This is a particularly wonderful evening as far as I'm concerned. I want to welcome, slightly specifically, I want to welcome the developers in the room, the people in this audience who are in the process of developing affordable housing around this nation. We're very pleased to have you in our house here, and we hope you'll enjoy your 2 days, and we hope you'll leave a little bit of your inspiration and wisdom around our halls. We'd like to do that. For those of you in the Design Resources team, we're particularly happy to have you here. This is a place where we think very carefully about design, and we think a lot about what design can do in our cities, in all the parts of our cities. And we're particularly glad to have you in the house, and we hope you will also enjoy your time here and rub up against some of our students and our faculty and share your wisdom with them. This is and let me just say welcome to the students who are in the audience. I see a lot of familiar faces of our students who are so interested in this topic, our faculty members who are here, friends, advocates, allies, welcome all. This is a good time for the Graduate School of Design to host an event like this. Each entering class in the last several years has measurably had a greater number of people who are concerned about the ability of design to make a contribution in the social and public interest elements of our society. And our faculty and our curriculum is quickly catching up. We're offering more and more courses, more and more studios, more and more internships that will enable people to fulfill this element of their architectural drive. Most designers that I've met just can't not make things. And we want to encourage that subset, along with all the others, who want to make things that will make our cities safer, more accessible, more just, as well as more beautiful. Dean Mostafavi has created a small, elegant, short mantra for our school in the last couple of years, and it is design excellence, societal engagement. We don't think those are alternatives. We think those are two things that go together very nicely. And certainly what you're here to talk about for the next couple of days is exactly along that line. So, Katie, in a word, you may have to fight off some of our students who would like to be in these discussions tomorrow among the designers and the developers that are coming here. Now, we're here tonight because of the Enterprise Foundation. The Enterprise Foundation, of course, is the brainchild and passion of that wonderful developer, Jim Rouse. I had the pleasure of hearing Mr. Rouse speak a few years ago before he died. And it was, he said a very powerful and very short thing. He said, if we want to solve the affordable housing issue in our country, we must intend to do so. We have not yet intended, with all of our passion and with all of our commitment and with all of our skill, to solve that problem. He quoted President Kennedy. President Kennedy didn't say, I'd like to get about halfway to the moon. I think that'd be a good idea. He said, we're going to the moon in the next 10 years, and because we intended to do it and put our money and our will and our skill behind it, we did that. And Jim Rouse insisted that we could do that with affordable housing if we simply gave it the same level of attention and the same level of focus. The Enterprise Foundation, founded by Jim Rouse, celebrating now its 30th anniversary, has put over $11 billion into the affordable housing movement in the last 30 years, leveraging that into about 300,000 housing units. They've specialized in green affordable housing, which is something nobody was sure we could do 5 years ago, and we now are pretty sure we can do that. And, of course, the Enterprise Foundation has also been the parent organization for the Rose Architectural Fellowships, which pairs young architects with community-based organizations across the country as a way of improving the design of affordable housing in those organizations build and in those communities, and perhaps catching a few designers who would like to spend their career in that part of the world. So I want to turn you over now to Katie Swenson. Katie is an alumna of the Rose Fellowship, a distinguished designer. She now holds the title Vice President of Design for Enterprise. And she founded this Institute for Affordable Housing Design Leadership along with Loeb Fellow Maurice Cox a few years ago and designer Larry Scarpa. So please greet the energy behind the Affordable Housing Design Leadership Institute and much of the passion within Enterprise for the issues of design, Katie Swenson.
Thank you, Jim, for that great welcome. And thank you to all of you here at the GSD. Thank you to the Dean, to Eric Belsky from the Joint Center of Housing, Scott Cohen, the Loeb Fellowship, all the Loeb Fellows, and especially Jim and Sally. Thank you especially to Brooke and her crew for making this such a pleasurable experience. We're really delighted to be here. I want to first just say that Jim has been on the selection committee of the Enterprise Rose Architectural Fellowship, I believe since its inception, which means that he might have been on the selection committee for me 10 years ago. I'll assure you it was not so competitive then. But now at a 3.2% admission rate with the Rose Fellowship, we are delighted to have really some of the brightest stars in the field in our program, two of whom are graduates of the GSD. So Teresa Huang is here with us today. She graduated in 2007, and we're going to hear a little bit more about her later. She received her master's in architecture here. And Laura Shipman, who is currently working in San Francisco, graduated in 2008 with a Master of Architecture in Urban Design. Hope I have that right. Laura's been working in the Tenderloin in San Francisco. If you've seen, some of you students have seen a new David Baker building open, the Richardson Apartments. Laura was deeply involved in that gorgeous project. The Tenderloin, the work of community housing partners in the Tenderloin builds housing for chronically homeless. She's also been working on the Treasure Island Planning Development Program, sort of advocating and planning for the needs of San Francisco's most vulnerable population. So we've been delighted to have these two fantastic graduates from your program in our program. I'm first going to have the wonderful pleasure of introducing Mayor Menino, a man who needs no introduction here. We are so delighted. The mayor has been a tremendous supporter of affordable housing from as long as I've known that term, I would say, and a remarkable forward-thinking visionary on the sustainability issues and green issues. Over the last many years, as many cities have really struggled with foreclosure, economic crises, under Mayor Menino's leadership, Boston has built more than 20,000 new housing units with 20% affordable and low and moderate income households. So it's really kept Boston as a vibrant city for all of its citizens. We're thrilled with his emphasis on innovation and design. I was delighted to be at the Boston Architectural College at the unveiling of the E+ program that the city has developed. They charge teams of developers and architects to build on specific sites throughout the city. 3 sites, they had 14 entries, 3 winners. So to win that competition, you actually now get to build it. So I love a mayor who puts his money where his mouth is about vision and action. Welcome, Mayor Menino.
Thank you, Kay, for the introduction. Thank you all for being here. When I was asked to be here this evening, I jumped at the invitation because there's not too many forums on affordable housing. There's not too many forums on housing at all, because it's not the sexy issue we deal with in public life, because it just takes too long for us elected officials to get credit for it. You know, we elected officials are all egomaniacs. and we all want our name in the newspaper the next morning. And that's what I've always believed, that this is one of the most important issues we could do in our cities. And we've had some success in Boston over the last several years. It's because of a couple of young women who work for me. Sheila Dillon, I'm sorry, my housing advisor, and Evelyn Friedman, who's Department of Neighborhood Development, to work with me almost on a daily basis on those issues. And I want to thank Jim Stoddard. Thank you for all the work you've done. And my favorite guy over there, David Lee. He's one of the best guys around. David, thank you. You know, you want to talk about pioneers in architecture and going to the neighborhoods that nobody else would go into. David Lee was there way back when, and we appreciate all the work you did, David, to help us bring back some of those inner city neighborhoods and the design you came up with. It's so important. You know, design to me is probably the most important thing we do as we build affordable housing. Because I know in the past, and previous folks in my position just built it. They didn't care what it looked like. They didn't care how thin the walls were. They didn't care if kids had places to play and things like that. On my administration, my staff will tell you the things I always say: front door, back door, some yards. Give people the respect they do, and have a place for the kids to play. And I make sure that all the stuff we're building, and my friend right here, Gail from her CDC, has built that so many times in our city. And I just, you know, because, you know, look at, I'll just give you an example. Our Hope 6 in Boston. Come and take a look at our Hope 6. You know, Orchard Gardens was done maybe 13, 14 years ago. It's still in as good shape today as it was 13, 14 years ago. Why? Because we respected the people who lived there. We gave them a little piece of the rock. We didn't put them all together and pile them on top of each other. I really believe that's how we maintain the quality of affordable housing in the city of Boston, throughout our country. But like I say, we elected officials don't want to get involved in this issue. I could tell you I was president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors for a year and a half, and the executive director was always mad at me because all I wanted to talk about was housing. He wanted to talk about something that would make headlines, because I think this is the long-term issue that we all have to grapple with. And I just say that, and thanks to Enterprise for bringing the designs here to Cambridge. Cambridge is one of those places that's across the river. You need a passport to come here. But you all want to go back to Boston because we're a real city. This is some other institute where I can't figure it out. But, you know, the interesting thing, I just want to tell you a little sidebar. Go back to your hometowns with. Cambridge owns more property in Boston today than they own in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So eventually the address is going to change from Harvard, Cambridge to Harvard, Boston. Let me just tell you, you read the Globe today? They gave you the deadlines of things that are going to happen in the new development. But I just tell you, if I stay as mayor, as long as those developments happen, we'll have them all Boston, Massachusetts. And, you know, this is really a great forum, folks, to explore new innovations in affordable housing. I'm pleased that you'll help our city, the city of Boston, on 2 projects: Talbot Commons in Dorchester and Brighton Campus in Brighton, Massachusetts. Enterprise and Boston share many of the same principles, and for several years I was involved with, on the periphery of Enterprise with Pat Canavan, who was a rep from Enterprise for so many years. We share the commitment to fighting for quality, affordable housing, for strong and diverse neighborhoods, for access to opportunity, even though it isn't always the flash, like I said. Housing work is fundamentally to help thrive in neighborhoods. So all of you, thank you for your work in the vineyards. I also want to thank our housing partners in our city who help us, from CHAPA to LISC, Bob right there, and from the Mass Association of CDCs. I get up and tout our success because of the great work they do every day. So thank all of you, and sometimes we don't agree. That's okay. We get to where we want to go, and that's important. And thanks to Harvard for hosting this event. And the other sponsors, I saw some sponsors on the brochure. Thank you for having that commitment. Like I was said earlier, you know, we've built, I think, 20,000 new units of housing, and 20% of those are affordable. The largest public housing energy we have in Boston right now, energy efficiency project in our country's history, is underway in Boston. We have built a top-notch foreclosure prevention team to help keep people in their homes. I'm very proud of the work we did on foreclosures. We were the ones who started the program with Don't Borrow Trouble several years ago. And over the years, we worked hard on that issue, and we didn't have the problems some other cities had because we had a good training program for folks who wanted to buy housing in the city of Boston. And I always say the underwriters of those mortgages should all be in jail. They're all blaming the banks, but the folks who wrote those mortgages all be in jail because they let people who buy homes. I've seen those mortgage papers. They were paying more money than they made. But you know something, we're not letting those guys. We're letting those guys go and blaming the banks who could afford paying off the deals. Our success on the housing front is one of the main reasons our population is growing fast in Boston than New York City, Chicago, and San Francisco. And just yesterday, we were named one of the 6 top cities in economic power in the world, before Beijing, Hong Kong, and Sao Paulo. Just think about that. And one much smaller city. It's based on the work we're doing on life sciences, on investments and other things, innovation. If you dig into the numbers, you see our population is not just growing, it's also changing. Boston is a majority city, and 73 different languages are spoken in the schools of Boston. In addition to that, 35% of our population is between the ages of 20 and 34. We have a higher proportion of young adults than any city in the country. That is important. Cities are competing for these young talents, and we're winning. When we have about 250,000 students who go to school around our city, and most of them inside the city. We retain 46% of the graduates from our colleges every year. That's what keeps our economy straight. You know, we have, just to digress, we have 4 economies that drive us: higher education, healthcare, financial services, and tourism. Those are the 4 economies of Boston. The first 2 are really the foundation of our city. When every other city in the country was going bellying up, we maintained our financial stature. And we have, you know, the state's bragging about getting AA plus bond rating. I've had it for 4 years. They're just catching up to me. But, you know, that's how states are. They catch up to some cities. Now, given the changing demographics of our city, how do we change our affordable housing strategy? How do we make sure our affordable housing is serving extended families, promoting a healthy and green lifestyle, providing new live workspace for our entrepreneurs, and saving energy for homeowners? You know, we're going through this whole innovation district in the city's waterfront area, but the real question is, how do we build affordable housing for those folks? We're on an initiative now to try to work co-housing, live workspace down in the waterfront, because, you know, Vertex, which is a pharmaceutical company, is building the largest privately funded development in the country. And where are all those people going to live? And we're going to make sure that we have places for those folks to live. These are some of the questions we are wrestling with in our city. My team and I have some good ideas. We know that we don't have all the answers. That's why I'm so grateful for the partnership with Enterprise. Affordable housing is the kind of thing we should all engage together. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the results. My team will be back to me. Let me close by saying the work ahead is not easy, but I believe we continue to work together, explore the latest housing ideas. We can improve and preserve affordable housing in these difficult financial times, and more importantly, we can improve people's lives. But also, you know, all from different cities, states around America. You know, we're in difficult political times, too. And, you know, we have folks down there who don't speak to each other. I'm asking all of you to get to your elected officials, understand, we're still about people. And they're down there to try to help people, not to fight with, if you're a Democrat or a Republican. The country is in crisis. And we must get out there and get off our butts and get those guys down in Washington. It's about helping people, folks. And that's what this is all about. And I'm getting a little tired of, well, I'm a Democrat, I can't do that. I'm a Republican, I can't do that. That's a lot of baloney. Who sent you down in Washington? No person down in Washington was sent just by Democrats or just by Republicans. It was spent by two-party or three independents, too. But, you folks here, you come to do this affordable housing. I appreciate that. I always be a cheerleader for affordable housing. It's so important. But if we don't get those guys down in Washington to understand they have to help us, look at the HUD budget. I mean, we're sitting by and say, oh, geez, it's terrible. But, all of you who belong to national organizations, you have power. Use that power in Washington. Just don't go and say, hey, we got this problem. We read the newspaper, New York Times, crisis here, crisis. You people power. I know in Massachusetts we changed our educational process because of parents. The parents went to the State House and drove those legislators crazy. And we got educational reform. You could do it in your organizations too, folks. If you really care about those folks who live in our neighborhoods, you care about affordable housing. Don't sit in the sidelines. Just don't let somebody else do it. We need all of you folks to be involved. I ask you all to get involved. Don't stand by, and because we're coming to next year this time, we won't have a HUD budget. We won't have anything. Hope 6 are gone. You see in the budget, they said all the public housing is in good condition. Give me a break. I mean, I could say Boston is. I mean, we did a great job with the Undersecretary of HUD right now is the woman who ran my housing authority, Sandra Enriquez. But I just ask you all, please step up. You're active. I know housing folks in my city, they're the most active folks in Boston. You, in your own city, are probably the most active also. Don't let somebody else do it. Don't let the newspapers put you to sleep. Say you can't do it. You can't do it. It's people power. It's about us all doing it together. So I thank you for your opportunity to join you this afternoon and for the good work that you do every day. I look forward to working with you in the future as we move forward on this issue of affordable housing. I know it's not the most fancy issue out there, but it's the most important issue. If people don't have a decent place to live, quality housing that's affordable, you treat people with respect, those neighborhoods of ours will be in terrible shape. And I just want to say to you all, thank you for being in the vineyards. Thank you for making a difference. I appreciate the work you do. And if you're Sheila and Evelyn on my team right here, my leaders, I have other folks on the team here with me also, but they're my two leaders in what we're doing. And my CDCs, they're wonderful people. They just did a project with us and in the city of Boston. Bob Van Meter done a great job with us. And so there's all of us working together. It takes a team. One individual can't do it, folks. So let's stay focused on what we're trying to do. Affordable housing. As we do that affordable housing, let's energize ourselves to tell those guys down and women down in Washington. It's about people and how we improve people's lives. Hey, thanks for having me by. Thank you. Thank you much. Thank you.
All right. What a start to a fantastic week. I was so pleased earlier to meet with all the developers and designers. And Mayor, thank you for setting us on our way. Step up. I'm so pleased. And I will say that I've had the rare opportunity to really work deeply with a lot of the mayor's team. A great visionary, absolutely, and with a fantastic team supporting him. So many thanks to all of you in the city of Boston. I'm going to introduce Michael, but I am going to say some thank yous first, absolutely. First of all, I want to mention a few people who are here tonight. We have the 2011 MetLife Foundation Awards for Excellence in Affordable Housing. There were 4 winners nationally and 2 hailed from Boston. And I believe that there are folks from both Jamaica Plain Neighborhood Development Corporation here for their work on the Julia Martin House and Benai Bereth Housing New England's Covenant House. So congratulations and thank you. We're also pleased to have Enterprise's Cheryl Gladstone here. She is part of all vulnerable populations with an emphasis on senior housing, a pressing issue We're going to be looking tomorrow with Amy Scheckman at Jewish Community Housing for the Elderly at this issue as well. I also want to thank our sponsors. First of all, I would thank the McKnight Foundation, who is based in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. They are a foundation that set out to increase the quality of architectural design in their city. It was a board mandate, and they looked for every opportunity. They've hosted a couple of Rose Architectural Fellows, and they were our founding sponsor of the Affordable Housing Design Leadership Institute. So we're so pleased that this year, although they only fund in Minnesota, they're helping to support us today because they valued this opportunity to work locally and think nationally, and it had such an impact there. So a special welcome to, I think we have some representatives from Minnesota Housing here today too, so we're excited to have you join us this week. The Condata Fund has also been a long time triple bottom line sponsor of ours, and we're especially grateful to the Boston Foundation for being a lead sponsor. We're so glad to have your support. You support all of the CDCs and all of this good work in Boston, and we're proud to be amongst those. Also to our design sponsors, the Mel King Institute, MACDC, LISC, Massachusetts Housing Investment Corporation, Wynn Companies, the Barr Foundation, and Boston Private Bank. Thanks to all of you for supporting the Institute. We also had a pretty robust steering committee working on this. So I've seen many of you out there from the Boston Society of Architects, the City of Boston, the Boston Redevelopment Authority, CHAPA, the GSD, LISC, MIT, Wellesley College, Boston Architectural College, and I'm sure, and MACDC, Mass Coalition of Community Development Corporations, and the list undoubtedly goes on. I also have to put out a very big thank you to my team at Enterprise. It's really been a wonderful experience putting this together. I want to make a special call out to Amber Christofferson, who is responsible for almost all of this evening. Thank you. Amber has been the primary organizer of this event, but as a landscape architect herself, she's also worked deeply with each of the developers to help prepare them for the Institute. And so I thank her for bringing her multi-talents to this, and to our colleague also, Trinity Simons, who's here, who had worked for the Mayor's Institute on City Design. She now runs our Rose Fellowship program, and she's invaluable to our team. We have also a whole sort of crew. Dana Borland will be in the house, the director of our Green Communities program, and to everyone at Enterprise who helped. I must say, when the mayor said, the HUD budget, I will tell you that this is the kind of thing that Enterprise cares about deeply. We try to work locally so we can understand the issues on the ground, but they always have to feed up into a larger national policy platform. So we want to learn from each of you community development organizations and then translate that learning to a larger program. So Michael, thank you for coming. He's had a busy schedule. He's been on the road. Michael Maltzan hardly needs an introduction here. He's one of yours, a GSD grad, so coming home to Piper Auditorium. Design principal of Michael Maltzan Architecture, founding his own firm in Los Angeles in 1995. Michael has a Bachelor of Fine Arts and Architecture from RISD and a Master of Architecture degree with a Letter of Distinction from Harvard University. His work has been recognized with numerous accolades, including 5 Progressive Architecture Awards, 22 citations from the AIA, and maybe my favorite, the Rudy Bruner Foundation Gold Medal for Urban Excellence. But I'd like to explain a little bit how we know Michael. We have the pleasure of running the Enterprise Rose Architectural Fellowship Program that I've referenced, and all the current fellows are here, so make sure you meet them. They'll be in session with us. Teresa Wong, who I mentioned earlier, graduate of your program, has been partnered with Skid Row Housing Trust in Los Angeles for the past 2 years. She's just entering her 3rd year. Each of these fellows works in partnership on the development team of a local CDC. We're going to have a fellow with Nuestra Comunidad in Roxbury this coming year. We're excited to have our first fellow in Boston. So it's an interesting relationship, I would say. These fellows as a whole, the 35 of them over the last 10 years, have been involved in the design and development of 7,000 units of housing, and we have about 3,000 units in the pipeline right now. The fellows work in very diverse communities, though. We have fellows in the Northwest Bronx. We have a fellow who's here working in farm worker housing in Puerto Rico. We have fellows who've been in tribal communities, urban, rural, all kinds of different typologies, but all of them really dedicated to this core notion that design is amongst one of the very important strategies to really make a difference in people's lives. So Skid Row Housing Trust, they're an incredible CDC. They have long really believed in design. For the past 20 years, they've worked with a host of great designers. Wade Killefer, Lorcan O'Hurley, Koning Eisenberg, and Michael Maltzan. They have come to find that design is really a key part of their strategy. It's sort of design in their eyes that makes the difference between getting someone off the street and getting somebody into a situation where they're able to reclaim their lives and start out. So they design on Skid Row, one of the toughest neighborhoods. There are about 30,000 homeless people in Los Angeles. I'm sure Michael will talk more about that. So Michael has designed 3 buildings for Skid Row, as well as many of you may have seen the Inner City Arts Building as part of the MoMA show last year. So they're currently in design development on the 3rd building. And Teresa has had the wonderful opportunity to split her time between Skid Row and working in Michael's office. So I want to really thank Michael not only for being here tonight with us and providing inspiration for us, but also really of being a fantastic mentor to Teresa and for all of us. Nikolai Orosov wrote of Michael in the New York Times when the new Carver was recently debuted a couple years ago. Mr. Maltzan may be the only American architect of his stature with significant experience in a far less glamorous field, providing shelter and other accommodations for his city's poor. His designs deliver a major blow to the conventional notion of contemporary architecture as little more than an indulgence of the rich or highly cultured. Michael, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Katie, Jim, for inviting me, Moisen, for having everybody here. The mayor, who is a pretty tough act to follow, but impressive, I think, the level of dedication that he has towards this issue of housing. And I think in many ways, the most striking thing that he said tonight was that housing by itself is not a glamorous issue. And I think that that's true in that it's not an immediately gratifying issue. It's not an instantaneous issue, but an extremely important one, obviously, important one to him. I want to talk tonight about our approach to housing and the way that we think about housing, both for me personally in the office and then to also talk about a few of the projects that Katie mentioned. Unlike many architects who was raised in an architectural education partially here and at RISD, as you heard, that saw housing as one of the fundamental typologies of modernism, it was a project type, or is a project type, where those architects, certainly the earlier architects at the beginning of modernism, intertwined the most progressive of their approaches towards space and technology, ideas about living and politics. I bring this up because, for me personally, I was deeply influenced by that work, as I think many generations of architects have been. And I came to believe, because of that in the beginning, that architecture was at its core an agent of change and progress, and that housing was at the center of that ideal. It's an idea I still very much have. and hold dear to myself. We all know these images. Housing is the context of a new and very much an optimistic world. These were not only projects that were for the particular program of housing, but they were also very much a demonstration, an image, an icon of what the future of modernism in that world would be. But we also know a lot of these images, which fairly or unfairly became icons for architecture's role and relationship in what many people felt was the diminishment of the sense of progressive form and reality for housing. I think that out of this late trajectory of modernism, architecture lost its role, or at least people became suspicious of that role, as an agent of real ideas, solutions, and progress for that future. As well, one of the things that makes this whole conversation complex, certainly in the United States, is that housing, especially in a city like Los Angeles, became preempted in the discussion of the way that we live by the house. And while in and outside of cities everywhere, we built a lot of them, huge quantities of them, the question of the collective group or collective society rarely comes up, in fact. And that idea of the collective, or very much the lack of the collective in the conversation around the house, is a subject that is arguably usually avoided. And that avoidance, I think, could also be considered itself a definition of the suburb. But just because the history of the house and housing has had this complex past doesn't relegate it, I believe, to the periphery in architecture of urgent contemporary and social issues and questions, or that it's marginalized from the conversation of what's at stake for the future of our towns and cities, even when the control of that conversation about our cities and making things in our cities seems to be mostly in the hands of speculative development. Housing, I believe, is one of the few building typologies to still contain all of the pieces of what we think about when we think about the form of a vibrant and sustainable social and civic life. Or at least it has that potential, I believe, which is why we in the office are so interested in it being a major part of the type of programs that we're involved with. This is a satellite photograph of the office. And the reason I show this image is because within the entire context of the office, hang on for 1 second. Within the entire context of the office, housing exists thoroughly all through different parts of that office. It's completely intertwined. It's a major part of the work of the office. And for the people in the office, including Teresa, who has been, actually Teresa, I think Teresa sits here, has been such a significant part of the ongoing work of the office. The office doesn't think about the work separately. We don't think of the work as socially conscious component of our work, a term that I've grown to hate because it makes it seem like all the other work that we do is unconscionable. To us, it's all unequivocally and equally architecture. This started in many ways with the first project for the office, which connected many of my original interests for architecture between education, arts, and most importantly, architecture's potential role in urbanism. In Los Angeles especially, where most people believe is in many ways anti-urban. This is a project for a school, Inner City Arts. You can see downtown here. And this project, which is developed over many phases over the years, is first and foremost a nonprofit arts institution, a school that partners with LAUSD, with the Unified School District, to take kids out of the school as a part of their normal school day and to bring them to Skid Row and to teach them art, because art has been taken out of most of the schools after Prop 13 passed in California. This project, for me, was an important start to the office. Really, this was very much the first project. And it was important as well for context, not only for its program type, Skid Row District is an intense, inhospitable, relentless, and extremely unlikely place for architecture to exist. And in that way, I think one of the founding questions in the office and for myself was, could architecture exist in this context? And to challenge ourselves to see if architecture could in fact exist in this context. Because, though, of the unlikeliness of this context for architecture, with few, if any, expectations on Skid Row, and this is an image of a street right around the corner from both Inner City Arts and the housing projects that we've been doing, it felt possible to experiment, to push beyond the existing models for schools, and certainly this is an important point for the rest of what I want to talk about tonight, that the very unlikeliness of making architecture in this kind of context has given us great freedom and latitude to go beyond the accepted and the expected, and to search for solutions that, because they are based on in many ways, the unexpected, can be very direct and transformative in suggesting alternatives and to purpose new models or strategies for both the buildings that are being produced, but for the urbanism that is the result of those projects. It's not just this district, though, that one could say is unlikely. Los Angeles itself is unlikely, at least when the discussion turns towards cities and urbanism. Inner City Arts was the first of our projects to begin to explore three traditional questions of cities in an untraditional context: community, identity, and density. Very traditional, very normative questions about urbanism, or almost cliches about urbanism, but in this context, potentially take on new and very different meaning. One of the things about this I want to mention is that the way that we look at these cities, the way that we treat these projects in these districts, the way that we think about these projects is not just about the projects themselves, as I mentioned, but the cities. And Inner City Arts was first and foremost an idea of emerging urbanism. In this district, this is for the most part Skid Row. You see downtown here. The Los Angeles River is behind us. The school was inserted as a first phase, and then a second phase, and now the third phase, where it has begun to take over the entire head of the 6th Street block, which connects East Los Angeles into downtown. Perhaps the most radical thing in this project is its whiteness. The whiteness of the building is both, in this particular project, a neutral canvas for the art, but it's also a challenge to the community to preserve an iconic optimism that it represents. It's a challenge to this neighborhood to potentially try to preserve that sense, not really very so much the purity of the project, but to preserve the fact that it has the status of being a center of optimism, and that the whiteness of that building is the projection of that as an idea. The organization of the project is very much as the organization of a town. It tries to replicate many of the mechanisms of the city, the relationship between individual parts to a collective whole around a larger open space, tries to produce a sense of both individual identity and responsibility to the individual piece, but also a sense of responsibility to the collective whole. In that way, architecture goes beyond an idea of pragmatism, but is very much meant to begin to try to tell the story of how one might live in a more optimistic or progressive city. In that way, it is as much a teaching tool as it is an enclosure for the teaching. The courtyard in that context is a new form by proposing really open, unprogrammed, but very much civic space between these different buildings. And these large roll-up doors open up, and the relationship between inside and outside becomes quite blurred. Now, talking about the city during a housing lecture may be seem a little bit off topic, but for me, they're completely parallel. The entire reason that we're invested in housing is because of its relationship and its potential to transform and create real change in cities. And for me, the idea of the house and housing and its relationship to the city is inextricable. Somebody who I've had a great deal of respect for, Yona Friedman, the utopian futurist thinker about architecture, wrote, "When I was a schoolboy, I discovered that a house alone does not exist, that it does not end at the outer limits of the ground floor, but continues out onto the streets, the garden, then to the house across the street. The house across the street itself continues into what is in front of it, and so forth. To imagine one house is to imagine the whole world." And by extension, I think, to imagine the city. The first project that we were involved in with the Housing Trust was Rainbow Apartments. And that idea of the relationship between housing and the city was very much on my mind when we were contacted by them in the about 10 years ago, maybe 8 years ago. They were in the midst of evolving their model from an SRO type to permanent supportive housing, which was something that they had never done before, and I had never done housing, so somehow they decided that was a perfect match. But that sense for them, for the Housing Trust, that because there was a completely new model that was evolving, and that architecture had a role in that, in beginning to define what the future of this new model would be, and to help begin to sort through the complexity that came from that new model, I think is one of the defining characteristics of the Trust as both a client but also very much a partner in this idea about the way that housing can continue to look at reinventing or inventing new models for architecture, for housing, and the city. This project, the Rainbow Apartments, is 89 units. It was targeted in the beginning to be about half filled with a community of people who had HIV and AIDS infections. That was intentional at the time because in this early model of supportive housing, the idea was to gather as much as possible a commonality for the support mechanism to be in the building. And I'm sure in talking to this crowd, many of you know what supportive housing is, but for those who don't, this new model was intended to bring the traditional support networks, including medical care, psychological care, social workers, caseworkers, to the building, as opposed to forcing the tenants, the inhabitants, to go back out onto the streets and to find those services. And that was important because the problem of recidivism was a very real one, that as soon as people went back out onto the street, they were constantly confronted with a gauntlet, really a thicket of many of the things that had kept them out onto the street before. So while in the shelter model, they may have come off the street for a short period of time, inevitably, as they made their way back out onto the street, they made their way back out more permanently on the street. And so this idea of supportive housing was meant to create an armature within the buildings that would allow the tenants to take advantage of that, not have to go back out onto the street. But it also had the added benefit of potentially creating a more cohesive community. Along with that was the idea of it being permanent housing. This was not transitional housing. It wasn't a bed for the night, but these were apartments that people would be able to have ostensibly for the rest of their life. And that changed the model of people's connection to those apartments, but also the needs of the apartment themselves. This project is very much at the heart, it can't get any more at the heart of Skid Row. It's in between two streets, San Julian and San Pedro, which I think arguably you could say is the epicenter of the town square of Skid Row. The new programs that had to be added to this project, as I mentioned, were some of the supportive houses, but also to do things like expand the community kitchens as well as having kitchens in the units themselves, to expand the laundry facilities and the other social and physical, medical, psychological counseling spaces. But even more so, if there was invention in the project, it was at the scale of the collective of units. One of the biggest ambitions that the Trust had for this project was to try to build a sense of community as a way of confronting and combating the isolation of many of the individuals that existed or that they saw in the shelters. And this was something important that we learned about the characteristics of the homeless and beginning to deal with this project, was that if you are homeless and on the streets so consistently, chronically, and in the public realm, actually, if you are constantly a part of or constantly exposed and open in that city, that in a sense you create this protective shell, this incredible shell around yourself to produce some sense of yourself and some sense of protection from that world. Ironically, in a very intense way, the most public of those individuals became the most private in their psychological characteristics. And for me, that was important because I don't. I'm not unrealistic about what architecture can do in the scheme of these very deep social and political problems. But I do think architecture can have real effect if it is targeted to specific problems that architecture can take on. And one of them was to try to create a forum for reintroducing people to public interaction in a more safe or semi-public way. That by itself is a spatial idea. The original model, the model of the SRO, was the double-loaded corridor, where people would come into the building, up the elevator, anonymously through the corridor and into their room, and you would never see them again. That model allowed people to continue to propagate this isolationism. What was at the core of what we were trying to do in Rainbow was to crack that model open, to create an interior space in which the tenants, the individuals, were in a sense forced to be in some level of more semi-public contact. We weren't going to dump people back out onto the street, but by cracking the box and creating a single loaded corridor where people coming out of their unit, literally just to go outside the building or to go to the kitchen, all of a sudden we're in a space that was connected to this larger courtyard space. And that ongoing navigation and negotiation of this space for these individuals had the possibility to begin to give them the tools to navigate or renegotiate their relationship with what eventually is the outside world. That idea is a spatial idea. It's very much an architectural idea. The project is organized, it's a 6-story building, and very typical of the models of pretty much all of the projects that we've done, because they have to be built with similar financial and funding mechanisms to a lot of the typical developer housing in a place like Los Angeles. 1 floor of concrete, a concrete podium, and then 5 floors of stick-built or wood-built construction up above. The podium became a real opportunity for us, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But in the first floor of the project, you see that the whole this is the main street, San Pedro. The front part of the project, which was the entry and then stairs up to the upper courtyard, had all of the social services in a series of offices very much on the front of the building. Unfortunately, because this building was still being built in Los Angeles, we had to provide an enormous amount of parking under that deck. Once you came up the stairs to the courtyard, you began to be surrounded by the housing units. That ran all the way up through, but there were some important public or semi-public components that were organized around that courtyard. One was the laundry room right at the top of the stairs, which was the destination, the common the democratic destination for everybody in the building. The community kitchen out on the other corner with views out over the street. And then on the next floor up, a bridge structure, which was the common meeting room for the community. And that bridge up above had an outdoor deck where you could be up even further into the courtyard space. You see the original models of the project, the outside space, the U-shape of the courtyard itself, the stairs up, the single-loaded corridor that then wraps around the back. So some of the units are looking into the courtyard, some of them are looking back to different directions, east and west in the city, and then the courtyard, the bridge structure up above, and that outdoor space on top of the bridge. The community kitchen was here as you came up the stairs, and the bridge, which spans across the whole courtyard, starts to create a shadier space underneath the building. But it's really about the linkage or pivot of those different social spaces that were important to me. I mentioned that all of these buildings are on one floor of podium. And that's something that began to be characteristic in all of the buildings. How do you navigate up through the building to this new semi-public space? It's not on the ground floor, it's not all the way at the top, but it's really that first level up. It's a space that is not far from the street, but is connected more to this interior space of the courtyard. And the way in which that space has evolved in all of the projects is probably, in all the projects I'll show tonight, is probably one of the places where the greatest amount of exploration and hopefully invention has taken place. The outdoor courtyard space has very much been taken over by the community. It's not just a place to see across and to see the other individuals in that community, but has been embraced as very much a social space, a party space, a lecture space, a barbecue space, and increasingly a garden space. The courtyard, which was very much a hardscape for obvious financial reasons, or probably obvious financial reasons, has increasingly been filled in by a series of large-scale planter boxes that have been retrofitted into the building, in which the community begins to grow in that courtyard. The idea being that that space is the heart of this community. This is looking up into or up through the courtyard to the sky. And you can see the passageways of the balconies out from the units, and then the windows into the units. Each of the units is absolutely identical, and this was something that was a part of the program. There was a sense that while there would be a collective space, one of the other parts of this, the democratization of this community would be that every unit was exactly the same. The only difference really being the window placements, which begin to shift back and forth and create a sense not only of difference in the unit, but also very much a level of individuality on the exterior facade. And this was also something that was quite different, which, even though it was a very small move, was very important to have two windows, and to have one window that was very high that begins to bring daylight deeply off of the ceiling of the space, very deeply into those units, so that you could close this window with a shade, create privacy, but still allow natural light through the space. Those are operable. They were operable windows as well. And then while small, the kitchen that had small cooking functions that allowed the individuals for the first time to really cook in their rooms, so that that space could be not so much the space of the individual, but that you might be able to make dinner for you and somebody else in the building. Here you see the exterior of the building and also very much the context along San Pedro Street. And this is an earlier building of the trusts. But this kind of light industrial quality, the standoffishness of the opacity of the walls in this side of town was something that we were trying to, while change, also understand that they were it was one of the characteristics, the coloration of this part of Skid Row. All of those characteristics of the place could potentially be woven into the building. From one direction, the windows and the sunshades of the buildings create more opacity to the building, and from the other direction, they completely open up and become a confetti of color that act as iconic signs for the building as you come, especially from the downtown part of Los Angeles. I mentioned the courtyard and the financial issues on the courtyard, and the reality is that financial issues of any architectural project begin to have enormous impact within these projects, and this project was no different. One of the issues was that this project was designed, and because of the funding mechanisms, had to be completely budgeted very early on in the project, even well before we were finished with complete design. And the problem with that was that over time, the economy took off. It was one of the periods of greatest run-up in the economy. And so while we budgeted the project and funded the project in one economy, the reality was construction prices continued to go crazy. The inflation was intense, and you couldn't keep up with it in any kind of architectural project. But here, it was almost like we designed the project in one economy and then tried to build it in a completely different economy. And because of that, and because the fact that the costs and the prices of building materials were changing all the way through the process, it was a construction process of constant value engineering, or really taking things out of the building. And one of the things that got lost in the building was a series of screens that created some level of separation between those walkways and the courtyard, some level of intimacy, but also a sense of it was a scale of screen that was both at the scale of the individual and the courtyard. It was trying to be that in-between facade, really a communal or civic or city-scaled facade that we weren't able to hold on to in the project. And it was an important, very much an important lesson in the project, because it was in that conversation that we began to understand that this question of our work and architecture in relationship to these projects had to find not just a practical way of dealing with these issues, but a philosophical a relationship to the way that we deal with these issues. To begin to ask the question in our work amongst ourselves in the office, what is fundamental to architecture? What is absolutely necessary in its most distilled form to still be able to say that the project rises to the level and aspirations of architecture? And what effect can architecture have when you think in that way, no matter what the fundamental costs, parameters, context of the building is? How do you approach the project from that standpoint of the fundamental and essential qualities of architecture, in this case in relationship to housing? Coming out of that process, it was not uncommon at the time for architects to do one of these projects and then to confront those realities of what was fundamental to architecture and decide that was the last project they were going to do, and to move on, to have paid their dues, to have done their time, and to move on. I felt that if you were going to do this work successfully, and what was interesting to me was that the only way of doing this work was to do many of them, to take that experience from one project and begin to migrate it into your approach to other projects. And so I called the trust and asked for a meeting, and I went down to a project wrap-up meeting, and we got there, and I think they were very much expecting me to say thank you very much, and that was fantastic, and hopefully we'll see each other around at some point in the future. But in fact, I was asking them to do more, and not just to do one more, but to do many more of these projects. It was, in my mind, a way of beginning to develop an essential partnership where both sides, both the client and the trust and ourselves as architects as well as the consultants, would begin on this journey together of trying to imagine in each iterative project how we could constantly evolve the model to a more useful, a more pragmatic, but also a more architectural, more cultural, more beautiful project. Rainbow is here. There were, as I mentioned, Skid Row had built another project here. After Rainbow, and this is the only Google image I could find, this project is now done, which was the Abbey Apartments by Koenig Eisenberg, all built in a row, and then there are other social services, the Midnight Mission, Drop-In Center. One of the things that I began to realize, and I think was very much on Skid Row's mind, was that their success could potentially be their urban downfall. That by creating so many successful projects, by propagating a density of these kinds of housing projects, that they were in danger of recreating the monoculture of the large, enormous projects that I showed earlier on that were built in the post-war period. That in any individual project, these projects could be seen as quite successful and intimate, but taken as a whole, you're completely changing the dynamic of the neighborhood. And because of that, Skid Row began to look for the possibility of moving their project to other parts of the city, to expand this question of where housing should be, affordable housing, housing for the homeless, to other parts of the city. And they found a site that nobody, I think they got because nobody else wanted, next to the 10 freeway, proximate to downtown, but also, interestingly, extremely proximate to the convention center, Staples Center, where the Lakers play, and now this large entertainment development called LA Live. This project for Carver was a little bit larger, or is a little bit larger. It's 98 units with an emphasis more on elderly, formerly homeless elderly individuals. It was an incredibly challenging site. It was very small for 98 units. In fact, it seemed like it was going to be impossible to fit those units in. It was oddly shaped, kind of a half or a quarter crescent shape. But the biggest issue was the proximity to the highway. It created enormous problems of acoustics, especially for tenants immediately adjacent to the highway. The quality of the air could potentially be a problem. And in some ways, the visibility was very much, the visibility of the project was a question as well. But for me, the most exciting thing about this project was exactly the visibility, the fact that it was so visible. The idea that you could move that community into a much more visible relationship with the larger civic or the larger community of Los Angeles as a whole. And while it might not be an absolute physical relationship where one person would quite literally be next to each other, they would be so proximate that that visual relationship would be extraordinary, or could potentially be extraordinary if we took advantage of it. And quite frankly, in most cases, in a city like Los Angeles, the fact that you even see one another is a radical, very much a radical idea. With this project, we were looking to put people back into a conversation, as I was mentioning, between each other, a conversation with the larger city, partially by being visible, but also very much by making an image. And we were criticized, we've been criticized for creating iconic social housing, which is exactly what I think should be done, to create iconic social housing. The fact that it looks like something is not a bad thing. It's one of the most important things to help reestablish a sense of connection, pride, and visibility for the occupants, the inhabitants, and the building's inhabitants, tenants. But it's also very important for the city as a whole to not be able to hide from this reality of a siloized set of communities within the city. I learned a lot from Rainbow, as I mentioned. Some of it was just in the approach to the way that you would begin to strategize and think about the project. As I mentioned, the site was quite unusual, and we tried many different configurations on the site, and we began to settle on this circular form for the project, which was a little bit, a lot unusual for a housing project. But it had some very strong attributes. What we realized was that the circular form provided the maximum amount of floor area to the minimal amount of circumference. And since we're always dealing with the problem of surface area and the cost of surface area in relationship to how much floor area we can provide, that was an interesting beginning to the project. The second thing was that it created the smallest amount of surface area in proximity to the highway and to the noise, which is the noise generation. And the physical properties of acoustics mean that every foot you get away from the noise source, you get a significant drop in the decibel level. And that was important because we knew that the cost of trying to mitigate the acoustics was going to be an enormous cost of the entire project. This just gives you a sense of the construction as it started to move up, and the stick building of the building, the circular form of the project, the interior courtyard that was the result of that, the donut at the middle of the space, the lower level, which I'll talk about. But one of the other characteristics of the project that was interesting as this round shape was that you could almost make a building that started to feel like it was in motion as well. And given that so much of people's apprehension of this project was going to be in motion from the passing by of cars, I was fascinated by the idea that maybe the building could be in a kind of choreographed dance with those people as they drove by, and that was one of the ways of beginning to capture some sense of relationship, that if the building felt like it was in motion with you visually as you moved around it, that you couldn't help but feel like you were in some kind of maybe romantically a dance with the building and the inhabitants in the dance. And we did many, many different studies of the way that we would create a type of staccato nature. You can see in the plan that form begins to fan out. It allowed for some openings in the building, but also this slightly serrated facade had great advantages in terms of the way of actually building the building. So it was a series of straight segments. It had some added advantages acoustically, but it also began to create very small indications of the individual unit in the collective facade. And that idea of the individual in relationship to the larger whole has been something that has been an exploration both in the form and the facades of all of our work in this relationship. And here it is going by. It's going to happen twice. So hopefully it doesn't, well, I'll do it 3 times. So you get it. And that's about as fast as you ever go by. Very often people are in a more ongoing relationship with each other because they're not moving so quickly. The ground floor is very different in its form and its plan from the rest of the building, the tenant floors, the apartment floors. And here I was trying to create a space that, or a series of spaces that could almost be seen as, both from inside and outside, an extension of one of the characteristics of this place, which is the underneath of the highway. While the highway up above defines very much the upper circular form of the building, I'm just as fascinated by the underneath of the highway. It's a kind of space which tends to be unused, but is also a space which is very characteristic of Los Angeles, and is increasingly, I think, going to need to be one of the characteristics of infrastructure which begins to be changed. And this project had as its aspiration to not necessarily to revamp that space or to change it. It was outside our scope, but maybe to give you indications of the way that something at the scale of infrastructure could have a relationship to something at the scale of a unit of the city, either whether it was housing or any other kind of project type. And that entire ground floor was made out of concrete in the same way that the understory of the highway was. The columnar structure of the highway was replicated in many parts of the building. The Hope Street comes along and bends in this direction. The highway is right here, and the underneath of the highway is right here. This view that you see on the left is taken from the community room out towards the highway. But there's a series of almost boulevards or avenues, spatial extensions through that connected the alley to all of these streets visually, as well as being able to be accessed physically. So while the building very often isn't open, it's a secure building, there's a sense that as you move through these spaces, which also include the community rooms, the community kitchen, the main office, this meeting room, as I mentioned, and resident managers' apartments, that you're constantly given the sense of visual trajectories deeply into the city. So from that ground floor, there's a sense that the building is very much connected to a continuity with the underneath of the highway, the continuity of Hope Street, all the way out to the alley as well, and the extension of Hope Street on this side. The building, which you saw from above, from the highway, is also meant to be seen from this lower space. As I mentioned, that extension visually where you see the entry, that entire concrete side of the building is at this level. You can begin to get a sense here that the highway, which very much right now divides 2 sides of the city, has the potential to actually connect 2 sides of the city. And I think buildings like this, and siting buildings like this, and buildings which have this kind of visibility, have also the role of indicating that these thresholds or these seams that have tended to divide the city are also very visible. In the same way that the community that exists in this building was once anonymous and now is much more visible, in the same way these urban conditions need to be made significantly more visible as well. In the inside of the building, the inner courtyard is a very important space, as it was in Rainbow, but it's in this case much smaller. The scale of the space is a much tighter space, although events do in fact often happen here. From the lobby, there's a large staircase which is at the center of this internal courtyard, and its intention is not just to take you up to the primary second floor, but is also very much meant to be a place to be, a place to sit, a place to have conversations, a small amphitheater for the community to meet when there are meetings within the community about what's going on in the building as a whole. In that way, it's not a flat courtyard, but it is very much a stepped and very much occupiable series of stairs. As opposed to Rainbow, where most of the social services were all on one floor, here I was trying to change that model to begin to spiral those different spaces up through the building, so that the section of the building drew people up through into the individual units. So it was an experiment in seeing if these social spaces, here, the community kitchen, the entry, the laundry room and meeting and TV room, the smoking porch out towards the city, that all of those were opportunities to quite literally draw the individuals up through the building, as opposed to allowing or hoping that that semi-public space would work by having it all on one floor. The inside of the courtyard, as I mentioned, was quite tight. One of the things we learned from Rainbow, and one of the when we lost the screen on the inside of the courtyard, was that these elements have to be more fundamental to the building, as I mentioned. And one of the ways of doing that is that no individual architectural unit can only do one thing. No individual architectural component can be a monoculture in and of itself. It has to do multiple duty. I was very concerned because of the tightness of the courtyard, that the visibility across would be too exposing for the community. And so what we started to do was imagine this series of fins, horizontal fins, almost like the blinders that a horse wears, where you can see directly across. So as you move around circularly around the courtyard, the farthest dimension is always the thing that you can see, is always very visible. But as you begin to look through your peripheral vision, it becomes more closed and more opaque. So it has an inverse relationship to that movement. But the fins have to do a number of other things. They become primary structure for the balconies. We're hanging all of these balconies off of tension rods that are inside these enclosures, fin enclosures, which is a very efficient way to hang the balconies. Secondly, all of the roof drains migrated out to this interior perimeter, so all of the roof drains drop down through the building. And then also there was some methane on the site, which is typical in Los Angeles. And there needed to be a series of methane vents up through the building. So by pulling them into the courtyard, we didn't have to navigate them up through the walls of the units, which is very expensive and a problem. And it also gave us a way of starting to create a very pragmatic texture on the building, and then cladding all of those necessary items became a way of reinforcing the architecture and the use of the architecture in terms of the social and visual dynamic inside the building. Here you see that interior space and the fins in the building. There are two primary stairs here and here, which are open to the outside. So as you move up through the building, you're really in a way outside of the building. The elevators are here as well. These are images of the units. The units changed quite significantly. Is that in focus? Can you see that? It seems a little, maybe up there, maybe, I don't know. It's in focus here on my screen. We changed these units quite a bit from Rainbow. In Rainbow, it was a unit that had the small kitchen and the bathroom all at one end, and you entered the unit and you were directly into the space of the unit itself. At Carver, they're quite different. where the bathroom migrates to the middle of that space and the kitchen is in the front of it. That did a couple of things. It allowed us to create a much larger facade, which meant that we could get a window and a door on both sides of the unit to get flow-through ventilation. But it also meant that the kitchens were right off of that courtyard, so that as people were working in their kitchens, they were a part of that social space just outside of their window. You can see the kitchen here, the bathroom is entered through here, and then the unit the efficiency unit, which includes table and chair, a bed, lounge chair. This is one of the tenants' bathrooms. Everybody, because it is permanent housing, very much transforms their unit. Some of them have serious decorating skills. Some of them have a more a different sense of how they decorate their units. An important part of the courtyard, though, was also to frame this idea of the vertical, to use the vertical as a real attribute. That interior space creates a space away from the intense acoustic environment of the highway, but it also begins to give you the sense of vertical expansions, of vertical extension, to give you very much the sense that in that collective space, that the sky, that sense of openness and extension is a part of the optimism and the identity of the building. I mentioned those individual spaces that spiral up through the building and that the building acts as a kind of compass. The community room here and the laundry room were grouped together for the first time so that those two activities could really merge together. And that space is at the level, the third floor of the building, which puts it directly at the same level as the highway. It is the Carver Apartments front porch to this larger social space of the city. As you move up through the stairs, you connect to the other spaces I was mentioning, including this larger porch, which has phenomenal view of downtown. But to make downtown and the iconography of downtown a partner with the building, we were trying to find in any place we could, in sometimes the most incidental of spaces, ways of creating useful and social space for the community as well. Along the whole back edge, because of the round shape in this form of the building, of the site, we're able at the upper level to begin to create a series of community gardens which wrap around the building. This is an image of it at night. I think, as I mentioned before, if this project is going to have an influence on urban thinking, it's partially in the way that it engages the city in and of itself, but also has to begin to deal with, or has the possibility of beginning to deal with, the idea of infrastructure as something which is so defining in the city. While this hasn't completely come to fruition, one of our ways of thinking about this is to begin to ask a question of what would it take to begin to use not so much Skid Row as the structure and organizing district in the city for these kinds of projects, but to begin to take on some of the other much more characteristic components of the city, like infrastructure, like the highway, and look for sites that other businesses, individuals, and developers wouldn't necessarily look for, but because of the inventive quality of these projects, you could begin to imagine them as being real places to begin to build housing in an ongoing way, and to, in that way, completely transform one of those important characteristics of the city urbanistically. The third project, and the last project I want to talk about tonight, is ongoing. We're just about to start, we believe we're just about to start construction. Teresa can attest to that, which is a project called the Star Apartments. This is very much the most recent of the projects we've been doing. It's been an ongoing project over the last couple of years because the trust, like everybody else, has had to continue to negotiate the changing financial, economic realities of the world. But we're very much on the cusp of now finishing this project. Construction drawings are done. The contractors have bid the project. They're in all of the early construction meetings for the project. This project is moving actually back closer to Skid Row. Here you can see the project, the first project I showed, the Rainbow Apartments, and this is the project Star Apartments. It's adjacent to one of the city police departments, but is actually a little bit more on the edge of Skid Row, in an area that is defined by a lot of light manufacturing, small warehouse like buildings. Some small retail individual stores, but also some wholesale retailers as well. There were a number of new challenges that were posed by Star that are different than Rainbow and Carver. One of the things that that the Housing Trust was very much looking at in conversation with us was how to try to take, again, this problem of creating these projects as more individual or siloized projects and connect them to a broader, more ongoing and sustainable idea of the city. And one of the ways of doing that was to potentially create a project that would be mixed use, to add other components to the project beyond just housing. And the Housing Trust was very interested in potentially doing a retail project. But there's a problem with that, which has primarily to do with their funding, and that is that if you're in the housing business, you're not really supposed to be in the retail business, and it starts to create a series of impediments for funding. But there is, and I'm paraphrasing the way that they've gone about it. They'd probably not be happy with the way I'm describing it, but there is a loophole that exists in some of the housing codes, which says that if you have an existing retail use on the site, that you can keep that retail use going. And so the Housing Trust went out and started to look for full site retail buildings at the ground level, and this is a rendering of the project as it's being designed. The building that they found is also very much a characteristic building in this part of Los Angeles and Los Angeles as a whole. It's a one-story concrete slab, parking on top, retail space all along the ground floor. It's a quite large block on this side. The former owner's, we think, apartment is up at the top, and then again this continuous retail along the bottom. It wasn't bought for its aesthetics, and it wasn't bought for its facade. We're going to be changing that quite radically. But what is interesting is that the guts of the building, the frame of the building, still has very much a useful life that is a part of the reason for buying this building. It's interesting as well, I think, and also one of the reasons why this project starts to become a model for development in a place like Los Angeles, not only in its desire to build mixed use and to build it in relationship to housing, but it's to reuse an existing building, especially one which you would consider as lacking value, that would have in the past absolutely been torn down, been scraped clean, and a new building would have been built on top. And I can't describe what a new idea, what a radical idea that is in a city like Los Angeles, as it would be in many emerging or contemporary cities. The idea that you would value a building just because it exists, and to try to begin to transform that building and to put effort into transform that building. it's also an interesting thing because it's saying that density as an emerging reality in Los Angeles is an important characteristic of thinking about the development of the city and of these projects as well. And as opposed to removing existing density, to begin to work with that and to enhance that density. The reality is that by working with this existing building, it presents a series of very much pragmatic challenges, which include having to keep the retail businesses open for as long as possible and to not interfere with them as much as possible. And because the building occupies the entire footprint, staging the construction is also a very complex problem. We began to look at what other possibilities existed in thinking about building the building, and we began to get very interested in research prefabrication, multifamily prefabrication, as a way of thinking about this project. That also is a new idea. In Los Angeles County, while you're able to do prefabrication for single-family houses, where it's arguable whether it's really of economic use, you're not allowed to do multifamily prefabrication. And it's a bit arcane, but it primarily has to do with the fact that a prefabricated unit that is used in multiple is considered a product. And any product that is a part of a building in Los Angeles has to have a research report, which is our equivalent of a UL listing. And none of the prefabrication companies want to go through the process of listing their buildings for an unknown building climate or potential constituency. So in doing this, the first part of the architecture wasn't actually to design the building so much as it was to go out and negotiate with the city to allow this project to be a test project, a pilot project, to allow it to be the first project, multifamily prefabricated building built. And then the second thing was to deal with the fact that because these projects have to be competitively bid, that the prefabricated units would have to be bid by multiple construction companies, fabricators. And to do that, it had to be in their catalog so that somebody could say that it was in fact a product that could be purchased. So another part of our project was to work with multiple prefabrication fabricators to actually design their brochures so that these units were in their brochures. And the thoroughness of having to take these iterative steps were all very much a part of what we've come to believe architecture is, not only as a building discipline, but a strategic discipline. This is the way the project will be built. The deck that exists, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a moment, is remaining. We're going to use that, but we're actually suspending, propping a new concrete deck above that, which spans the entire site, which you see here, which becomes a tray for then the prefabrication to drop on top of it. And it has to do with the structural reasons for the project, because we are in a seismic zone, beginning to deal with the prefabricated unit and collecting the forces and dragging them down to the ground is another one of the complexities. And then you see these are stacking diagrams that'll take place. They stack 4 units a day. What's interesting about this is that the advantage is in the prefabrication is some of the things we talked about. It allows for the staging. It allows for the businesses to stay open for an extraordinary period of time. We're really missing the majority of their retail units by needling the structure down through. It doesn't mean it won't be loud, but we'll be missing their actual units. And it constricts the construction time quite significantly, so that after we pour that slab, the rest of the building is constructed in something between 4 and 5 months. That's a huge advantage because it also has the quality of minimizing the carrying costs for the trust, which has real financial has a real financial impact, in a positive way. The units themselves are not necessarily cheaper. That's one of the myths always of prefabrication, that they're cheaper because they're prefabricated. They actually are closer to what it would be to build them conventionally. But an important economic cost is long-term viability of these units, the ongoing maintenance cost of these projects. And the typical way of building these projects means that you build them very often lowest bid projects. They're not built very well. The subcontractor pool is not so strong. The prefabricated model allows for these projects, the units, to be built in a factory, which means that the quality control is much higher, which means that the trust, as well as the individuals, will have units that will last and be maintenance-free much longer, and that kind of cost is something that we're just beginning to really try to quantify, but is really something that will be quantified over the life cycle of, and the data that will be over the life of the project. Each of those stacks of the units begin to be stacked into smaller, almost building-like clusters, so that the units are not just around the perimeter, but are all the way through the full site, and that these individual clusters very much act like small buildings in a larger village. It has the advantage of creating a series of views and light and air deeply into the block, and it means that we can use the entire block in very efficient ways without having to go beyond the 5 or 6 stories, which is economical in these kinds of buildings. This project is also changing the model quite significantly for the trust, because in the past, the social services were really only for the tenants that were in the building. In this building, they're looking at expanding the social services so that there'll be service providers for other of the buildings that don't have social services in the neighborhood, so that this starts to become more of a center of a much larger community. Most of those services are down on the ground floor and then a mezzanine floor. Here you see some of the parking behind, because in this case we do need it for retail. The units up above, and then this in-between space. And that in-between space, which is created horizontally between the existing building and the new units, is, for us in this project, the equivalent of what the courtyard was before. Not a vertical space so much, but now a horizontal space that connects, because you're raised up a bit, out to the city as a whole. In the first project I showed, Rainbow Apartments, where the courtyard was a more enclosed space, more further removed from the city. In this project, you are both removed in a pragmatic way, but in a more consequential relationship with the city around it. And this has a little bit to do with some of the thinking about making public and semi-public social space in cities like Los Angeles, in this case a project for a museum in Fresno, which had similar characteristics, where the city is not mass dense, or doesn't have the same kind of mass density that you might expect in a city like New York, or even to a certain extent Boston, Chicago, Paris, London, but is a type of city which is much more open, much more porous. In this project, we were trying to create the public plaza by creating the kind of compression that you normally have in a courtyard vertically as opposed to horizontally. We've explored that in a number of installations, including one called The Dark Side of the Moon at SCI-Arc, which was taking these two surfaces and seeing what kind of connected or communal space could be created for events in between And this was an early diagram I was doing where this model doesn't really exist. This model of creating those spaces doesn't exist in a place like Los Angeles, where the compression that normally exists begins to peter out from the perimeter. And maybe this model is one that could be looked at in a building. And then another project that has been a real influence on that in-between space at the Star Apartments is Playa Vista Park, which we just recently finished, which is our first landscape project. Here we were trying to recreate in a park space by developing a series of specific activity spaces, activity bridges aligned with each other, an equivalent to that siloization that often takes place in a city like Los Angeles, but by developing it in a different way, a kind of bento box of activities for the city, that you could begin to imagine those activities beginning to, while they were parallel or adjacent to each other, that they would begin to spill over, and it would create a new dynamic for an intense and dense social space. The ground floor, the plan of the Star Apartments is very much that. The social and communal spaces are a series of indoor spaces which feather out or finger out towards the perimeter, and that begins to create a whole series of outdoor spaces that are defined by that ceiling, the floor, but also very much by their programs. And many of these spaces are on the exterior for the first time really physical activity spaces. Walking track, yoga spaces, outdoor meeting community spaces, basketball court, and horticultural growing gardening spaces that face to the south of the building. Community kitchen at the center, art room, technology, digital computer room, meeting rooms, laundry room, all through the building, this relationship between those common spaces and the outdoor spaces. And here, just a view of the ambitions of that kind of space where the activity of the community is very much in relationship, at least visually, with the city beyond it. And I want to end with this slide because I think in many ways it begins to hopefully wrap up much of the way that we're thinking about the entire project of the Skid Row buildings. Over time, I think cities have begun to put more and more emphasis and hope that cities will be transformed urbanistically by large-scale, very often privately developed spaces. So certainly that's the case over with the Convention Center and LA Live, just by their sheer scale that they have the gravitational force to begin to transform even cities as large as Los Angeles. They're instantaneous changes in the city. And I think in that way, potentially unsustainable, both in their scale, also in their type, because they tend to be, for the most part, privatized projects in which their perimeter, which seems very often to be permeable and social and public, is still very much a private facade, a private fence around that space. And because they're also instantaneous projects, they have the quality of being an alien in the city. Because they are instantaneous projects, I think there's a real question whether their longevity will be instantaneous as well. In projects like Skid Row, while Rainbow and the Star Apartments, Carver Apartments, Inner City Arts, some of the other projects that we've created are removed from each other and are quite small as individual increments in the city, that as a project as a whole, you can begin to imagine that a new network map starts to get created across the city, especially as people begin to understand and recognize them iconographically through their identity as important components, social and civic structures within the city, that your mental map begins to change in terms of of these projects, and that they begin to have very productive, over time, realistic abilities to both change that map, that sense of the city, but also through their accumulation, that network begins to have iteratively a scale which actually far outstrips the individual and developer-based commercial projects. And I think that is important in terms of our overall goal between the relationship of housing, architecture, and the city. That if we concentrate, or even though we might concentrate on a single project, that it's important to understand the combined and the cumulative effect of these, both for the positive and also at times for the negative. That effect can and should be large, and that the responsibility of architecture and of housing advocates, of developers, politicians, and funders is to realize the profound and important impact these projects have, not just on the lives of the building's individuals and inhabitants, but also, importantly, on the life and the future of the city itself. Thank you. I appreciate having been invited. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to. If not, you're free. Thank you. Thank you.
So when you talked about the financial constraints, you talked about timing and, pre-budgeting, which we all do. But you didn't talk about the constraints of federal funding agencies and the way they see things. And, I was really struck the double-loaded corridor, which we all hate and we all want to get out of. And then you go to HUD and they're right back in there. And just can you comment on how, I can imagine with you going to a funding agency, it would really change the dialogue. But just comment on the challenges we face with these very rigid rules and needs, because if you're creating deeply affordable housing, you're relying on federal government subsidies. And the way you are able to get through that and have this kind of creativity?
That really is a partnership between the Housing Trust and ourselves as the architects. And in fact, I think really the majority of that capability of changing the conversation with many of the funding agencies has been the ability to do that has really been with the trust as they've begun to build up a great deal of expertise and a real track record in that regard. When we started at Rainbow, I have to admit that we started some of our success at Rainbow, even though I talked about it in terms of some of the successes and also some of the things that the challenges that cropped up and we learned from it. We were incredibly naive. I was incredibly naive going into this. I just imagined we were making architecture. I didn't realize that there was this whole other, I was conscious that all projects have these set of challenges and constituencies, but I didn't realize to what extent how intractable in many ways they are. I think that the thing that we've been able to do with the trust in that partnership is that while it's primarily the responsibility of the trust to have those conversations and to begin to try to open that conversation up, that we absolutely, myself and the office as a whole, are very willing participants and conversants in that, and we do play a role in adding credibility to that discussion. But I think the thing that we do as architects more than anything is to try to give the trust the ammunition, the tools to make that case. And we are very intense about these projects. I didn't show too much about the process, but the level of investigation that we go through, the number of different iterations and models and precedents that we look at is all a part of trying to build a case, both for ourselves as designers, but also for the people that the trust goes out to. And that we think of the design process as being the first steps, not only of the final building, but the first steps in a larger conversation. We are building communicative tools for the trust, and that the design process is, when I talked about different architectural elements having to do more than one thing, I think the architectural process very often has to be seen as doing more than one thing.
I'm very interested in the last project with the
And again, this may have been a little outside of all the discussions you were in, but there must have been some very interesting research and discussion about the construction jobs. And if you're doing fabricated, where do those jobs go? What particular factories? How do contractors feel about that? How do trade unions feel about that? And can you tell us a little bit about what kind of discussions there have been, and how have you been able to advance those to get the project approved?
Again, we've certainly been a part of those conversations, but very often they happen at the level of the trust. That is the entire way that these projects are bought, basically, which is what we're talking about, after they've been funded, is, I think, I don't think that there's no silver bullet there. It hasn't been settled, and that conversation hasn't been settled. In a place like Los Angeles, absolutely, we have a very strong construction union. There is living wage legislation for some of the construction projects, and that's always a debate about is it right to build projects outside of that process, even though you're doing work which is a part of the civic and social fabric of the city. The interesting thing about the prefabrication part of this is that it's a hybrid structure, and that's one of the things that quite literally is being discussed and navigated. The meetings I was talking about, the early construction meetings are working through exactly many of these issues right now, because you have a building, the prefabrication fabricators just build the units, right? And those units are built in a number of different. There's one company we're looking at in Northern California. There's another one in Idaho. They exist around the country, and that's one of the things that you begin to look at, is that the contractor pool is not the contractor, or to build that part of it, you have to look outside. You certainly have to look outside Los Angeles. You start to become connected with really a manufacturing pool as opposed to a contracting pool, which is the more typical way that you think about these projects. But because they're only doing the units, there still has to be a general contractor and subcontractors, and they're building the entire base of the building, and they're building the structural frame and doing much of the facade work. So it's a partnership between those two groups. And the real question is, do you have two different contractors? The construction company, the fabricators have all of, they have the kind of legal responsibilities that any manufacturer has when you're making something at a plant. And those are not the same conditions as you have out on the site. They're two completely different ideas about OSHA regulations, and also the way that the city thinks about doing construction observation and permitting is very different. I don't know if I'm actually answering this question, but I think with this new with the new project, one of the things that we're going to have to figure out is how you rethink the structure of the construction process, and we're very conscious of that. That the fabricator is not a subconsultant, is not subcontractor to the general contractor. And the issues around liability are very different. The issues around scheduling are very different. And it actually starts to put a stronger impetus on the management, both with the architect and potentially with a construction manager, to take a new role of not just observing the project, but a more instrumental role in navigating or being the mediator between these two different worlds. And as scary as that can be, I'm actually very interested in that because I think it inserts the design advocate, who is very much the client's advocate, in a more deep relationship with the construction. So I think we're figuring it out, and this won't be the only way that this is the first time. The next time we'll know more, just like with each of these projects, and I'm sure continue to evolve that model. Any other questions?
Just quickly, because you mentioned some of the special populations these developments were serving, elderly, formerly homeless, people with diseases, how did you mesh accessibility for these populations with the designs that you made?
That's been evolving as well. In the first, in the Rainbow Project, I think I mentioned that each of the units were exactly the same, and I wasn't telling the complete truth. There's I think 4 units which are different, because that project was built at a time when the code had a more traditional view of disabled access, and so there were a certain number of units out of the whole population that were accessible in a more traditional ADA way. The bathrooms were accessible, were roll-in, all those kinds of things. With Star Apartments, there were 2 things. One, the code changed, and it really meant that we probably needed to look at all of the units being accessible. And that was an enormous burden, because all of a sudden things like, a very practical thing like the bathrooms were getting so large that there was very little room left over for the rest of the unit. And so it was a challenge from a planning standpoint on an already small site. But because that population was probably going to be significantly an elderly population, we were very cognizant. We were concentrating not just on how you would access the apartments, but also how the building could be a facilitator for those individuals, so that, yeah, maybe they could get to their unit, but they could also access and participate in other parts of the community. And so in that project, for the people who were able to walk but who wouldn't necessarily want to be out walking in the city for exercise, I didn't talk about this in the images in the presentation, but we created a series of circuits, both horizontal and vertical, that you could take around that building. And there's space all around the exterior circumference or for the most part around the circumference of the building. That includes those small gardens I talked about, community garden, which I didn't show. So you can take circuits and begin to get physical exercise just in the building, without there being a literal running track in the building. We were trying in that one as best as possible to balance this idea of the mandated accessibility that the trust was interested in, and obviously that the code was requiring, with a more, I described that as a quantitative adherence. We were looking for a qualitative adherence. And that was something that I felt the architecture could do. In the most recent project, Star Apartments, I think we've taken that a lot farther, that accessibility, and that's one of the experiments with this new horizontal as opposed to vertical social space. I think one of the interesting things there will be to see if that produces a greater level of connection and interaction between and mobility for the inhabitants. So I think in each case, we're trying something slightly different and moving increasingly from the mandates of accessibility that are important to something which is a larger cultural and social goal of the buildings itself. Thank you.